Could I just go on to ask you what you see now in the image regarding the slave trade and Cork?
Yes, this was another sort of attempt at excavating the image to look for hidden narratives that are not well acknowledged. So, going back to the histories that I was talking about previously about Cork being the centre for beef and butter production, but most especially salted beef. When I dug into that history further, I realised that much of this salted beef was heading for the West Indies, particularly, the islands of Jamaica, but also the colonies of the Dutch and the French. And the more I looked into these histories, I realised that predominantly these foodstuffs, especially the salted beef, was being used to feed enslaved people on these islands. And the reason for that being was that the monoculture of sugar production was seen as the most important thing to focus land for within the islands in the West Indies. No allowance was made for growing foodstuffs for the enslaved people who also lived there and for their slave owners too. Um, so much of the food that was eaten on these islands was actually imported, and the vast majority of it was coming from Cork. The French actually were one of the biggest importers of salted beef, and they changed the laws to make sure that even despite wars which were prevalent during this era, that they still had access to Irish beef because there was a sort of a combination of the right weather and the right location and the skill set that the Irish had long had in cattle rearing. The Irish were particularly good at creating salted beef for the lowest possible cost. The French just weren't able to match it. So this ties to the flight of the Earls. So when the English colonisers, especially during the Williamite Wars, a lot of the old Irish elite, old Irish Catholic elite, left Ireland. They couldn't stay on the island anymore. It was too dangerous for them. So they left in their droves and they went to Spain and they went to France. And many of them ended up in cities like port cities like Saint Malo and La Rochelle, where they set up and they became factors for trade in the French Empire and especially their colonial outposts. So these Catholic traders were buying beef from their Catholic counterparts. So about 20% of traders in Cork at this time were Catholic, and they were selling beef to their Catholic counterparts in France. And then that beef was being sent to feed the slaves. And they were actually in the Louis, the sort of notorious code noir of the Louis XIV era. They stipulated how much beef should be fed to an enslaved person each week. I think it was a couple of pounds each week. And this beef also, it wasn't good quality. It was usually the worst quality beef. So it was the hoofs, the heads. It really, I mean, it sounds pretty grim when you get into the history in further detail. And then the better beef was what was sent to the plantation owners, especially in the British West Indies.
Mm.
And also there was a sort of a broader swathe of skill set about salting provisions. So salted herring, salted fish also became part of the mix. So the Swedes and the Scots would send their herring to Cork, and Cork would then rebarrel it because they were especially good at creating salted provisions that would last for a long time, up to 12 months. And then they would rebarrel all of this fish and send it off on the ships. So within Butt's view, you can see ships on the quays, but also you see the wealth of the buildings. These buildings look incredibly ornate. There's a lot of sort of Dutch influenced buildings. So, there were Dutch merchants literally living here, or their Mannerist style of architecture was being adopted because you've got the Dutch, the French, the British coming back and forward. So this this is why Cork became such a hive of activity at this period, and had the wealth to build these beautiful new buildings and this important infrastructure with the quays. And just beyond this painting, there was a massive natural harbour, probably at the time the biggest natural harbour in the world. And it was full of flotillas of ships that were all going Atlantic bound. And you can see as well sort of some signs in the painting of the ancillary industries that were related to the beef trade. So down near the river, in the centre ground, at the base of the Shandon Hill, we can see what I think is a curry factory. It's actually on the map of the time. There's a road called Curry Factory. And curriers were those who created leather products off the back of the remains of the cattle that were butchered for beef. So they were making leather for saddles and boots and shoes and gloves and so forth. And we can sort of see the traces of that yard actually within the centre of the painting.
The evidence you found sounds very conclusive to me, I must say. I mean, those statistics about the trading of the beef over to the West Indies, and also there are other points that you make in your dissertation about what was coming back was rum, and there was a great increase in rum drinking dating from then. But there's going to be people who like their history pure and the history of pure Ireland, who won't necessarily be that pleased that this theory is, well, that your conclusions, not a theory, I think it's proven really, that your conclusions show that Ireland wasn't quite as pure as maybe people had hoped and separate from the slave trade. How controversial do you think this might be?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that historians have been looking at this history for decades now. I was really influenced by the work of Thomas Truxas, who did amazing work on the economics of the trade between Ireland and the West Indies. So this is all based on sound historical research. I think most people still haven't heard of it; they're just not aware of it. But I just find it really interesting. I do ponder, why have people ignored the historians to date? Why have they not taken this story seriously? But I think social change that we've seen through things like Black Lives Matter movement, and just generally, we are more open now to looking at hidden histories, erased histories, marginalized histories, and reconsidering them. And I think ultimately, my hope is that we are prepared or mature enough now to engage with the truth. And this is the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
As your book, that you've written about your grandfather, telling the truth is dangerous.
Yeah, it's true.
But I think ultimately you still have to hold fast to telling the truth.